Hey, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the People of Packaging podcast. I am your host, Adam Peak, and I am excited to be joined today by my new friend. We got to connect up through Taylor Foxman, who was on the show. She's an incredible connector of human beings. Shout out to Taylor for being so amazingly awesome. So I'm going to be joined by Sid Banthiya. Sid is an advisor and an investor with consumer businesses, and we were connecting, and I was like, what are we going to talk about? And we had an awesome sort of pre-show conversation, and I was like, shoot, we just should have recorded this thing because it was so good. So hopefully we can recreate some of that wonderful magic and have a great conversation and give you maybe some insight into what advisors and investors are looking for. How do they look at packaging? It's going to be a really, really fun conversation. So let's get going. Hey, good evening or good morning or good afternoon. I don't know if that, do you say good afternoon? Yeah, that's a word. Whatever time you're listening to this podcast, thank you so much for taking some time out of your day. It's considered TV, right? I'm guessing. We're live on the YouTube. Live on the YouTube. Not in Belarus, though. Told. For paper, you have to flatten it before you receive. I'm guessing they don't crush everything before they're collecting paper. Like 3D objects get routed away. If you leave your paper like a box, if you leave it assembled, the likelihood that it's going to be the back goes down. Thank you so much for taking some time out of your day to listen to the people of packaging.
Are you tired of managing your specs in spreadsheets, PDFs, or relying on suppliers to do it for you? Learn how SpecWrite can help you digitize and take control of your product and packaging specifications to drive sustainability reporting, SKU rationalization, and better collaborate across departments and with your suppliers. Go to specwrite.com to learn more.
Have you ever wondered, how do I reduce my carbon footprint? Should I focus on recycled content or reducing weight first? Which design strategies are the most effective for my products? Triac offers multiple solutions for lifecycle assessment, goals management, reporting, EPR fees, and more. Visit triac.com to connect with our team and register for a free 10-day trial of Eco Impact Compass to get started today.
All right, Sid, thank you for sitting through the wonderful introduction music. My son actually made that. He made the beat. He put together everything. He grabbed a bunch of audio, and I was like, all right, let's roll with that.
I love it. It's great. Yeah, no, it's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Of course. And where in the world? I feel like I need to sing the song. Do you remember the show Carmen Sandiego?
Carmen Sandiego. Where in the world?
Yes. I'm like, where in the world is Sid Banthiya? I don't.
I'm actually in New York, which is where I'm based, and so yeah.
Awesome. Do you get out? Does your job as an advisor and investor, that feels very like, it's like the thing that when you're in business school, I remember when I was in business college, that's what people said. Like, when I grow up, I'm going to be an advisor, or I'm going to be a consultant, or I'm going to be an investor. And my business professor would always be like, you got to do something first. You can't just like graduate college. But it seems like the kind of job that would take you all over the place, right?
And it's so true. I mean, I came out of school going into investment banking, and so my perspective to some extent comes from finance, just because that's where it happened to start. And to your point, I had a career in finance for some time. I was at UBS, and I was at Credit Suisse. I did a lot of work in Latin America, and I started to work on some consumer businesses towards the end of that. And I worked as an executive, and as I did that, began to invest in businesses. And as that happened, and I got to know more and more people just sort of in the ecosystem of, I'd say, just broadly consumer, I started to find that working with businesses on their plans and what they wanted to do, that there was a lot of good I could add. And so I started advising. But to your point, it was after sort of a history of having executive positions, investing in businesses, really thinking about them and having, I'd say, as I'm sure you've probably seen a lot on the podcast, but the highs and lows that go with, high growth businesses that are trying to do something a little different.
Yeah, for sure. It's something I've often said about the packaging industry and why I've loved it so much. I mean, I've been in it for 17 years, and it's that packaging ends up interacting with nearly every department in a company, right? You've got obviously you have a finance background, so you've learned about it from that perspective. And but because it's important to finance, it's also important to marketing and branding and advertising and sales and then operations and supply chain and legal, compliance, shipping, logistics, like all of it interacts with this industry called packaging. And so I've loved it, but it's crazy to me that I've never had somebody on really from the finance background. I've had regulatory people, plenty of branding people, lots of packaging engineers. So I'm really excited for you to bring your perspective to the audience of the podcast coming from, this financial background. So I'm pretty excited about our conversation.
Yeah, no, totally. And as a person sitting at a business, either in the CFO seat, which I've been in a couple of just sort of very branded consumer businesses. Milk Bar was one of them. Blue Apron was one of them. But businesses that many people in the world of consumer know. And I've had to, having been an executive in those businesses, really think about the role of packaging. And I think you're absolutely right when you sit down and actually, part of what we do in finance is help with budgeting, help with planning, and really start to think about not just sort of finance. And I think of finance, as we've talked about, Adam, as sort of the source of truth for everybody that's sitting in the business, that's thinking about experimenting, that's thinking about, hey, I did this last quarter, like how did it work out? Or I did this partnership, but what happened? Anybody that's doing something to some extent, those efforts should be reflected in the numbers. And so in some ways, I think of it as a source of truth. And you're right. The role of packaging, when you think about it in its elemental sort of numerical, just sort of quantitative place, you may think of it as, oh, it belongs in COGS, right? Like there's a P&L, like there's what it takes to actually, make a product. And everything that is related to that is cost of goods sold, what it cost you to make it, right? But what was so interesting, having been in that seat, was the number of other people that are commenting on packaging when you're going through budgeting, even when you're going through just sort of weekly, how do we do this week? How do we do this month? How do we do this quarter? You have, as an example, operations folks saying, at Blue Apron, hey, we didn't have enough blocks like ice within our packaging. It's the summer months. By the time it got there, we had bad customer experiences. As a result of that, we had to give a bunch of credits and refunds. Okay. You have people who are in sort of manufacturing supply chain saying, hey, I'd love to bring our manufacturing costs down, but I've been looking at all the manufacturers out there and they can't produce this packaging that we put on shelf because it's different than everything else that they produce. And they would have to change the line. They would have to change all of the people, the labor, how it is that they've designed their capacity planning. Everything would have to change. And I've gone through 4 manufacturers, and now I don't know what to do to bring that cost down. And the marketing side too, which in many cases will is really the lead in terms of customer experience, will say, hey, like we need something that pops off the shelf. Like we're a new brand, we're trying to get into this store. There are lots of people coming by. They only have so much attention. And how do we produce something that's different? I don't want to be stuck or put into this box in terms of my options as it relates to packaging because of what people see. And with that sort of customer service, same sort of thing, right? Like think about an opening the box experience and like what you want a customer to see. Like there's people who get 15 Amazon boxes who say like, hey, this is not what I wanted. I mean, like I know I wanted to order 5 things, but I didn't want 15 boxes to come with those and go throw them out, and this sucks, right? So I totally hear you in terms of all the different aspects and the things that hit packaging.
Yeah, I mean, it's fascinating to me because it does obviously vary by industry. It varies by, is it D2C? Is it retail? You talk about Blue Apron and the customer experience. versus, maybe a more retail facing product. And so you've even got salespeople who are like, hey, we got shrunk in the planogram at Target. And so we need to get rid of the folding carton and just have our bottle with a label on it so that we can get 3 across, or whatever it is. It's just,
Yeah.
there's constantly, I don't want to say there's constantly pressure, but there's a constant awareness of packaging for a CPG. It's literally consumer packaged goods, right? So you're focused on the consumer, you're focused on what you manufacture the goods, and you're focused on the packaging, and everybody sort of orbits around those 3 things, and they are all interconnected as well. That's a
Absolutely.
great point. So let's talk a little bit about, when you made that transition from investment banking and finance into sort of some of these consumer brands that you've talked about, and then what was that like for you? Were there things that were incredibly eye-opening? Maybe not just about packaging, but just that you were unaware of when you made that jump. Obviously, if it was things about packaging beyond what you've already said, that's cool because it is a packaging podcast. But just in general, I'd be curious because that seems like a jump that maybe not a lot of people make.
Yeah, and it's a challenging move, I would say, overall, in the sense that I found that there were many parts of business that I didn't appreciate in the investment banking world, not because they didn't exist or I wasn't aware of them, but simply because I had limited interaction with them and responsibility over them, right? Where most of what I looked at was really about financing. So how a business got to its quarterly results in terms of what different departments were contributing were less important to me than whether it made them or not, and what the capital needs might need going forward, right? So, but yeah, that transition was really interesting to me, and I'll give you a quick story in terms of how some of the revelations that came to me. I remember being at Credit Suisse, and we were out in Silicon Valley trying to find clients, find businesses to finance. And I remember us, meeting with Slack, which, feels so ubiquitous now, particularly at smaller companies, but at all companies, right? And we went to meet with them, and I was sitting with some of my colleagues just saying, okay, so what exactly does this company do again? And the reason that I didn't know and couldn't have experienced it was because at the bank, there were security reasons why you weren't allowed to use Slack. So in reality, I had never used it. I didn't know what it was like. And I could only sort of see it through friends or colleagues and watch sort of what they did, and then hear secondhand, what it was like and why it had that sort of addictive nature, and could solve problems internally for businesses. And I remember just thinking to myself, there's only so much advice I can give if I don't really understand the product. And one of the places where I felt like that was not true, and you had this opportunity to sort of talk to anybody out there, was consumer. And so when I started actually cooking more as a result of Blue Apron, I thought what's really fascinating about that is your actual behavior changed as a result of being engaged with this brand. And it ended up being the first one that I left to after Credit Suisse. And I think a lot of what I learned there was just how all of these different departments really contribute to what at the end of the day would be a quarterly result,
So you were a customer of Blue Apron, and then you were experiencing them, and that's how you kind of got connected. I was assuming it was like, an investment strategy or something, and then they brought you on, but that's crazy to me. It's cool.
I was a consumer, and like as a banker, you have all these companies that you need to cover to some extent, and understand what they're doing and how they're changing industries, et cetera. And I got really focused on it because I was using it. So I had created an internal deck about why I thought they were so interesting. And as we were talking to them, I reached out and I said, hey guys, like I love what you're doing. I'd love to talk to you in general, but also, as I mean, from a banker perspective, but also from a consumer perspective, because I think what you're doing is really changing how people eat. And, and they wanted to change the food system. That was the mission. So, which was really interesting to me and something that I felt strongly about as well.
That's really cool.
Yeah.
Well, I'd love to pivot here for a second because you're now doing more advising and investing, it sounds like, than you are
Yeah.
CFOing. Is that
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I'd say that's right.
Okay. So when you are looking at companies either to bring on to advise or to invest or to do both, and given your experience now with a company like Blue Apron, do you feel like you have that perspective and that experience to say, well, let's take a look at obviously your finances, obviously all that stuff, right? But do you come in now and take a look at like packaging and the manufacturing of things and to find out if there are ways to either make improvements or what role does packaging play when you're evaluating a company these days, given your history and your perspective?
Yeah. So I mean, when I look at businesses, obviously I get to know the teams, the founders, the folks that are running them, the P&Ls, and I get access to a lot of the information that's internal, right? So I'll be able to see from a trend perspective what's been going well, what's not been going as well, and then sort of have an opportunity to really think about what might be happening underneath. And I think what my experience does, post that, and when I interact with a lot of these businesses, it just gives me a greater set of questions from which to reach to, right? So, as I was sort of mentioning, packaging can hit so many different parts, right? Like, and you may just think of it as like, okay, you're at 60% gross margins. Can you just tell me all the different components and sort of how they've been trending over time? Yes. And maybe packaging is one of them. And maybe packaging, those costs have been going higher or lower, right? And I can say, okay, well, that's interesting, but it really isn't, right? From the perspective of a founder or an entrepreneur, like they can all read a P&L, right? Most of them.
Most of them, right?
And yeah, and if they can't, frankly, I fault finance to some extent, because I think finance, at being the source of truth, should also be the group that's educating the business around, where it is that their efforts are coming out in the numbers. But I also think of it as, hey, I also wonder if these packaging numbers, are impacting your sales. From the perspective of, well, what are customers either liking or not liking about what it is that you're putting out there? Is it getting noticed? How are you doing it differently depending on the channel? Because it's a really different thing to walk down an aisle and see a bunch of brands than it is to receive one directly at home in a direct consumer basis, which is different than if you do a marketing collab with someone else and your product shows up in a particular type of packaging, right? And they may all be different products, they may all be different environments. And so the interaction with the customer may be different in all of those sorts of things. And I think packaging has a role in all of those things from a cost perspective, and then obviously all the way to sort of the revenue side. And in between, right? Like how it logistically gets there, as we were talking about earlier, also makes a difference. If you're one of those, folks where you're dealing with occasions, right? Like, in other words, Milk Bar is a business that I spend a lot of time at. Wonderful business that does cakes and cookies, and
Did you know I ordered one that will be here. Actually, the week that this episode drops is actually my birthday. And so when we were talking, I went to the bar and I ordered it's like a pumpkin fall cake. Like, I don't know, I think it's like pumpkin and chocolate or something like that. But I was like, this looks delicious. So I ordered myself a Milk Bar cake for my own birthday. See, I'm excited to try out the experience, right? To experience it as a consumer in Utah shipping from, I'm going to guess, New York City, and we'll see how it goes. I'll let you know.
Yeah. No, and it's a look, it's a wonderful brand by a wonderful founder named Christina Tosi, who is just an absolute genius, as it relates to the desserts, and she's created this business that feels very much, like Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory. When you walk into a store, it's just got stuff everywhere, and and it's pink, and there's lots of colors, and there's lots of creativity, and there's, and as I was sort of just thinking about that as it relates to sort of packaging, like you really have to, that brand in particular, right? It's got a direct consumer experience, which you will have. It has an in-store experience. You'll find them in Whole Foods, in Target, all across different grocery stores. And then it's got its own stores. It's got stores in New York. It's got, a store in California. And when you walk in, that's a different experience that also has a packaging component. And they all attract, and the way that they interact with consumers is different across all those channels. And then things like partnerships, right? Like they do a lot of partnerships with General Mills, a lot of the big food manufacturers out there, and those also then manifest in different ways too. And you also see that in the packaging. So if you take about all that together, it's pretty complex when you think about all the different levels of it. I mean, from an accounting perspective, from a, how do you plan in terms of forecasting for it, from a marketing perspective of consistency of the brand across all those different, channels, from a consumer experience, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, it's that kind of, I think you said before, like this omni-channel impact of packaging is really big, and especially in sort of a post-COVID rapid onset of not just direct to consumer, but you sort of have this other direct to consumer that's like the 3PL or the Amazon, Walmart. So you have people ordering from target.com, for example, and then it ships to them. Well, you may not control what that's like. So they may get, like you said, the Amazon package or whatever that is annoying, and you can't really control that these days. And so, you have to focus on what you can control, which is typically your retail. How's it going to present on shelf? How's it going to present when it ships from your website, right? And then beyond that, it gets a little bit difficult, honestly. To the further away the packaging decisions go, the less control you have on them, and also it can create a very positive or negative impact. And then you take all of this and you layer on top this new influencer world where, maybe a company like Milk Bar plays in, I don't know. But if I would imagine they would have a really cool Instagram or TikTok or something like that. And now you have like TikTok shops are blowing up. And so you have to be able to make your packaging digitally appealing, along with, in reality, it has to match what it looks like digitally. So it's a complex world for sure.
Yeah, and the point, one of the points that you made, that I think is really interesting is control, right? And you're right in the sense that you have your own store, you effectively control everything, and that's including, as an example, you're doing your manufacturing, whether it's contract or you're doing it yourself. But when you're bringing in products, if they sell out, you can simply say, "Hey guys, like, sorry, I mean, we sold out. I mean, it was great," and you feel good about it. You're like, "Oh, we sold out. That's great." And and I'll get some more to come in. You also feel like you're losing sales because you clearly had demand. But on the other hand, you may be creating something in the consumer's mind that's, hey, this is obviously something that everybody wants. Otherwise, they wouldn't be sold out. But you
Right.
control it as a person running that business. As soon as you get into the world of wholesale, which is kind of what I was thinking about as you were talking about Amazon and Target, and when you're selling to a retailer, right? You start to get into, or you're selling to, another brand or with another brand, you start to limit your levels of control. And those levels of control go into many things. If you're doing the load in for Target, you will need to have a certain amount of inventory such that you can service. It has to be in advance such that it works with distribution and everything that they do to get product to store. And then once you're there, you talked about planograms before, but you have to be able to fit within that, within the store on shelf next to other products in a particular, from a dimension perspective, your packaging needs to fit. And if you don't, you can't get product, on shelf. And if you're short, then you may have a problem with the retailer, because if they don't have product on shelf to sell, they might say, I would have asked another one of my brands to give me more product, but I don't want to be in a position where there's no product on shelf, because then I have all this traffic coming into my stores and nobody's buying. So you run the risk of getting kicked out, right? So, which is completely different than your own store, where you're never going to get kicked out of your own store. I mean, unless
You're hanging out there for a while.
unless you can't pay the rent, right? Like, but yeah, but otherwise you're going to be able to stay. But a retailer, on the other hand, and that's why I found so fascinating about your point on control, is there are different levels of it, and you begin to lose more and more of it, which it's a different environment, right? You're also getting more traffic, and there's pros and cons. But you have to be able to plan for it, and you plan for it a bit differently if it's your channel or it's somebody else's. I
was trying to pull up this picture that when you were talking about the planogram, because I was in a store the other day, and if you're listening to the podcast, this will be like when the comedian, if you're ever listening to like a comedian, and he or she makes some gesture and everybody laughs, and you're like, I'm listening to your show, buddy. I can't see what you're doing. But I saw this. I don't know if you can see this here on my screen, but this creatine was too big for the shelf. And so behind it, they can't inventory it. You can't actually pull it off the shelf without like getting the bottom of it. And it's like, wow, who messed up here? That's all I kept thinking was, which of these parties miscommunicated what was going to happen? Or did somebody just set the shelf incorrectly and it's supposed to be down another rung? I don't know. But again, when you go back to control, if you're that brand, you don't know. You don't know that that's happening. You might be like, oh, our sell-through is terrible in this chain. Like, what's going on? And until you actually go visit it, you have no idea. So again, going all the way back to finance, right? Like you're going to see the truth come out of the numbers, and you're going to say, what's happening here and why is it happening? Whether it's a rebrand, whether it's a new packaging design, physical packaging, the graphics, the whatever, it's going to shake out in the operational costs increasing or decreasing, the sales increasing or decreasing, and you're going to be able to see it from the finance seat.
Yeah, exactly. And it's so interesting you say that, because one of the things that we invested in early on were people to actually physically go to the stores and see how things looked and were working on shelf. Meaning, is it at the front of the shelf? Are people having the problem that you just suggested with creatine, where they actually can't even get it off the shelf because they have to do some weird sort of concoction with the thing to get it off? Like, what exactly is happening? And to your point, you don't, from a finance perspective, you actually don't find out your units per store per week per item until those numbers come out, and you usually buy them from Nielsen or from somebody that puts out those numbers. But there's a delay, right? Mm-hmm. Which is, so speaking of the levels of control, you buy something direct consumer, that brand knows immediately what you bought, who you are, like what time it was, what you paid for shipping. I mean, literally everything. Somebody buys something in store, and you literally have no idea what happened, who bought it, where, what time of the day it was, whether they bought like another 14 things with it, or they only came in just for that one item that was yours. You literally have no clue until that delay happens. And then you get the units per store per week per item of X retailer or Y retailer. And then you go back to whoever it is that may be running your grocery business, your retail business, your salesperson, like, what happened 3 months ago? Because for some reason we dipped, and it's really hard. It's an interesting sort of challenge in an omni-channel sort of business, because even the information comes to you at totally different, rates.
Yeah, there are some cool companies I've had on my podcast that do kind of play in that world where they're using various forms of technology to do like heat map tracking, and where are people walking, and you're in a retail environment, are they stopping, are they or is your product out? So there's like a light sensor that you can put on the back of the shelf. It's a push bar, and the minute that last product leaves, you get an alert, say products out, right? So there are, I think there, because it's a massive problem, and there are some really cool companies out there. Shout out to let's see, was Retail Aware and Ariadne. So shout out to you guys for making some cool stuff and helping with that problem, because like you said, it was always a trailing, very expensive trailing indicator. Be like, what happened 3 months ago that we weren't selling? You're like, 3 months ago. I wish we would have fixed it 3 months ago, because what's going to happen on down the line?
Yeah.
That's such a great point. Well, as we wrap up here, Sid, I would be curious for you to kind of end with: are there any companies that you're currently advising or investing in that you just think are really killing it, that you want to kind of give a shout? We've talked about Blue Apron, we've talked about Milk Bar. I'm excited to get my own. They have one new customer so you can let who's the founder again of Milk Bar?
Christina Tosi.
Christina Tosi. You can let Christina Tosi know that you got one new customer for going on a packaging podcast.
I will. She loves all customers, so she will be very excited.
I love it.
Yeah, I'll mention a couple of businesses that I'm working with that I think are doing interesting things in general, and maybe go to some of the themes we've been talking about. One of them I just met with, recently, and we've been just sort of talking about planning, which was fun, is Pop-Up Grocer, which has been doing pop-ups for some time. They now have a permanent store in New York. They're going to be opening up new ones. And what I think is really interesting about it is it's one of those businesses that decided, I'm just going to do this myself, as opposed to go through another retailer. I'm just going to create the retail experience that I think customers want, and I'm going to put in the products that I think they want that may not necessarily be in a lot of the retailers. And some of them are relatively small businesses, right? So they're getting exposure, et cetera. But I think what she's trying to create and all that too is a better experience, both for consumers, but also for brands. Also for brands who want to understand the data and how they're doing, and be able to make adjustments quicker than the 3-month sort of delay, right? And also sort of help them as it relates to having more demos, having a greater ability to actually show what the brand means to customers, almost as if it was their own store, right? Like the closest you can get to that and still be, going through a retailer. And I think that's an interesting take just on the whole thing, right? It sort of reminds you of like what Foxtrot was doing, or what, like that they were trying to create these sort of experiences that were their own, that were different than what's out there, or the infrastructure. They're actually creating infrastructure.
You said that's pop-up grocer?
Pop-Up Grocer, yeah.
Okay.
And another one, a really great friend of mine, a business called Tacombi. It's a taqueria based in New York. They've got 20 locations, and they do incredible tacos and have a great just sort of Mexican, menu of items. And it's delicious. And what they've also done is they've gone into retail. So they do salsas and tortillas in retail as well. So you can actually pick them up and get that experience in retail. And I think what's really interesting about them is, as you sort of go through that store experience and they're expanding, geographies, and you start to be sort of connected to the brand and to the design and to what they're doing, you can also get that experience of either you're not there, or you just sort of say, you know what, I want to create all this stuff at home, but like, I just love that tortilla because it'll put me back in sort of Tacombi land, but I want to do my own thing. It gives you that sort of creativity to do that. And I think that's a really interesting.
How do you spell that company?
Tacombi is Tacombi.
Tacombi. I love it. That sounds awesome. I'm gonna check those guys out. I love I it's been really interesting to follow a lot of the different trends, and it does seem like I don't want to say like the taco, but just like the like healthy Hispanic or Mexican food I mean, Siete just got purchased for like
Yeah,
what, $1.2
a
billion or
billion
something like
too.
that.
Yeah, yeah,
There's some cool brands that are kind of emerging. It's neat to follow these trends and see companies that are emerging and having a lot of fun doing it. So whether it's that or it's my dude wipes or liquid death or I don't know, just like these disruptive
totally.
brands. I just find it all fun and fascinating.
Yeah,
Um, so, well, Sid, I really appreciate you coming on, man. This has been super insightful. I hope everybody has enjoyed our half hour or so conversation. How do people reach out to you? Can find you on LinkedIn? Is that maybe the best way to reach out and
exactly.
say hello?
Find me on LinkedIn, reach out and say hello. And yeah, if you're doing something in consumer and you'd like another pair of eyes, I'd love to talk to you.
Okay. Well, Sid Banthiya, thank you so much for coming on the People of Packaging show. I'm guessing this is your first and only packaging podcast you've been on. So I hope it was a delightful experience for you, sir.
Wonderful. Thank you.
All right. Thanks, Sid.
Yeah.